Okay, so for today, our topic is about the basal ganglia and its functions. And this will serve as an introduction for basal ganglia and its disorders, no? Namely the Parkinson's disease, no? Yung mga Huntington's disease, okay? Among others. But in order to understand those disorders, we must first have a sound understanding about the parts, the nuclei of the basal ganglia and its functions. Okay, so the basal ganglia is a collection of gray matter that is found in the subcortical regions of the brain. Okay, no? Since it is a collection of gray matter, as we have said in the introduction of neurosciences, gray matter or cell bodies collection within the CNS are more appropriately known as nuclei, while gray matters or collection of cell bodies outside of the CNS is more appropriately known as ganglia. Now, therefore, since this collection of cell bodies is found in the central nervous system, it is more appropriate to be called the basal nuclei. And that is the reason why in some neurosciences or neuroanatomy books, it is referred to as the basal nuclei instead of the basal ganglia. But again, no, since nakasanayan na siya, no, the basal ganglia has been an acceptable term also, no, for the basal nuclei. Okay, so what are the parts or the uh, nucleus, no, or nuclei included in our basal ganglia? It is actually composed of your caudate nucleus that is located beside the lateral ventricles. And then you have your putamen, and then you have your globus pallidus. And as you can see, the globus pallidus is divided into two segments. No? This is the external segment, and this is the internal segment. No? That's why in some anatomy books, the globus pallidus, these two segments, are labeled as GPE and GPI. No? GPE, globus pallidus externus, GPI, globus pallidus internus. Then you have your subthalamic nucleus, no? And your substantia nigra, no? Okay? Now, although the substantia nigra, no, is part of the basal ganglia, okay, it is no longer located in the subcortical region of the cerebrum, no, or the telencephalon, but rather it is already located in the midbrain. The substantia nigra is already located in the midbrain. So again, no, you have your caudate nucleus, you have your putamen, you have your globus pallidus externus, and globus pallidus internus. Then you have your subthalamic nucleus. And then in the midbrain, you have the substantia nigra. Ah, okay. Now, although the thalamus is part of the diencephalon, later you will see as we discuss the different pathways that comprise the basal ganglia. No? The thalamus is part of those pathways. No? So again, although the thalamus is part of the diencephalon, it is connected to those nuclei of the basal ganglia. That is why in some neurosciences books, no, baka magtaka kayo, the thalamus is included in the parts of the basal ganglia. Particularly, no, the two regions of the thalamus, yung VA and the VL nuclei of the thalamus. VA stands for the ventral anterior nuclei, while VL stands for the ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus. No, again, these two nuclei is part of the different pathways included in our basal ganglia. Now, those nuclei, no, of cell bodies included in the basal ganglia are actually arranged in clusters. No? We actually have two clusters, no, of nuclei in the basal ganglia. You have your corpus striatum and your lentiform nucleus. So please remember that. The corpus striatum is a cluster of the caudate and the putamen, while the lentiform nucleus is a cluster of the putamen and your globus pallidus. And what is the function, no, of your basal ganglia? No? In terms of motor movement, no, what we will be discussing here is yung function niya in terms of motor movement, because the basal ganglia has many functions. No? It also has function in executive and also in terms of emotional functions. But the focus of our discussion for this session will be more on the motor functions of the basal ganglia. So what is the function, no, of the basal ganglia? It actually has three basic functions in terms of motor movement. Number one is to facilitate, no, desired movements, no, facilitate, no, our desired or purposeful movements. No? Yung kailangan na movement ng katawan natin kapag gusto nating gumalaw, no? Okay, the basal ganglia facilitates those purposeful movements. Okay? Second, no, is to inhibit, no, or to stop movement. The basal ganglia, no, can facilitate and at the same time inhibit yung mga undesired, no, or yung mga non-purposeful or extra movements. That is why when we move, di ba, our movement is smooth and wala siyang mga extra unnecessary movement. Okay? No, it's because of the inhibitory functions of the basal ganglia. And the third function is to modulate, no, yung ginagawa niyang facilitation and inhibition. The basal ganglia itself, no, modulates yung facilitation of desired movement, and at the same time, it also modulates the inhibition of the unnecessary movements. So remember those three. Now, paano? No, how does the basal ganglia perform that function? Okay. If you remember, no, the discussion regarding the different areas of the brain, no, the Brodmann's area of the cortex, okay? So you will recall your area 4 or the primary motor cortex, di ba? In the precentral gyrus. The primary motor cortex, no, are the cells of origin of your corticospinal tract, no, or your pyramidal tract. At yung corticospinal tract natin is responsible for our voluntary movements, for the voluntary contraction of our muscles. Meaning, di ba, if you intend to move a particular part of your body, if you intend to contract a specific muscle, no, all of those action potentials, all of those impulses originates from area 4, no, from the precentral gyrus, from the primary motor cortex. But then again, okay, no, influences, okay, from the basal ganglia, no, okay, is also added to that primary motor cortex or to that corticospinal pathway. Ibig sabihin, no, yung ating basal ganglia is connected into that pathway so that it can perform its function to facilitate yung movement that the area 4 initiated, and then also to inhibit yung mga unnecessary movements, no, para maging smooth yung galaw that is being initiated by area 4, and at the same time to modulate that facilitation and inhibition. So in short, when your precentral gyrus, for example, this is your area 4, o di ba yan, ang corticospinal tract, bababa, dadaan dito sa internal capsule, tapos bababa dito sa, no, ayan, sa base, sa brainstem hanggang mag-cross sa opposite side so that it innervates, no, yung particular specific muscle, no? Okay? So iyan again is being facilitated and modulated by those nuclei of the basal ganglia. So ulitin lang natin, you will have to remember, okay, bakit nag-hang? Okay, so ulitin lang natin, you will have to remember yung different parts, no, of the basal ganglia. You have the caudate nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus, externus and internus. You have your subthalamic nucleus, and you have your substantia nigra, which is already found in the midbrain. No? And then those nuclei are clustered into, no, the corpus striatum, which is the caudate and putamen, and then you have your lentiform nucleus, which is the putamen and globus pallidus. It is important that you remember those clusters because, no, later as we discuss the pathways, instead of mentioning, now for example, caudate, we will be mentioning the corpus striatum, no, the cluster where the caudate is included. And as I have said earlier, although the thalamus is part of the diencephalon, okay, there are two nuclei of the thalamus that is part of the pathway of the basal ganglia. And that is your ventral anterior nucleus and your ventrolateral nucleus. So let us go to those pathway, no? I-discuss natin yung pathways na yan. So in the basal ganglia, you will have to remember the three pathways, no, that are actually involved, no, in those three functions that I have mentioned earlier. Sabi natin, what are those three functions of the basal ganglia? Number one is to facilitate the movement. What movement? That movement that are being initiated voluntarily by area 4 in the precentral gyrus, the primary motor cortex. And that is actually the function of your direct pathway. It facilitates the motions initiated by the primary motor cortex. While the second function, as we have said earlier, is to inhibit unnecessary motions, no? To inhibit the unnecessary motion that will come along with the desired motion initiated by area 4. And that is the function of your indirect pathway. And lastly, sabi natin, the third function is to modulate that inhibition and facilitation of motion. And that is the function of your nigrostriatal pathway. Okay, so isa-isahin natin, no, yung tatlong pathways na yon. Let us first discuss, no, yung direct pathway. So when we said, no, when we say direct, by the way, no, etong pathways na to is these are the pathways wherein we will be able to see how the cerebral cortex, specifically the area 4, is connected to your basal ganglia. Kasi di ba, sabi natin, ang function ng basal ganglia, no, is either to facilitate those motions, no, initiated by area 4, or either to inhibit the unnecessary motions that will come along with the motions initiated by area 4. So therefore, the basal ganglia must be connected with the area 4 of the cortex in order to perform those functions. So if you will look, in this diagram, This diagram represents, no, itong pinaka nasa ibabaw na to, ayan, it represents the cerebral cortex. No? It represents the cerebral cortex. And then yung lahat ng nasa ilalim, lahat ng nasa baba, this represents the nuclei of the basal ganglia. At itong mga linya na to, na multicolored, iba-iba ng kulay, kung makikita nyo, may kulay red, no? May kulay blue at may kulay green. This represents the neurons that interconnects, no, the cortex to the basal ganglia, and then from the basal ganglia to the cortex and also to the thalamus, no? So let me just first erase yung mga ink, no, para masundan natin yung color coding dito sa slide. Erase muna natin lahat. Yan, okay. So magko-color coding tayo. So simulan natin with the direct pathway. No? So when we say direct pathway, it is comprised of the circuitry of neurons, no? Or the loop of neurons that connects the cortex. Wait lang, yung highlighter muna. That connects, or laser muna, that connects the cerebral cortex to the corpus striatum, and then from the corpus striatum to the globus pallidus internus, okay? And then from the globus pallidus internus to the thalamus, particularly the VL and the VA nuclei of the thalamus, and then from the thalamus back to the cortex. Okay, so that's how the direct pathway, no, is connected. No, that's how that the basal ganglia is connected to the cortex through the direct pathway. So, that's how the basal ganglia is connected to the cortex through the direct pathway. So that is how the basal ganglia facilitates those motions that will be initiated by area 4 or the primary motor cortex. So makikita nyo, no? There is a series of how many neurons? 1, itong kulay red na to, no? Then 2, itong kulay blue na to, yung kulay blue na to, no? Doon muna kayo mag-focus, huwag munang pansinin yung mga other neurons. And then 3, another kulay blue. And then 4, okay, is another kulay red. Okay. Now, by the way, yung color coding ng mga neurons na yan, okay, no, indicates yung kanilang neurotransmitter, no? The neurotransmitter that they release. So what are those neurotransmitters? Pag kulay red, tandaan niya, lahat ng kulay red in the slide, okay, no? The neurotransmitter released is glutamate. Okay? Na lahat ng kulay red ay glutamate. Okay? Ang inilalabas. Okay? Lahat ng kulay blue ay GABA. Yan. No? At lahat ng kulay green, actually isa lang yung kulay green yun lang siya. No? Okay? The neurotransmitter is dopamine. Okay? No? Dopamine. Yeah. Aside from that, what else do you need to remember? Okay. What is the general effect of these neurotransmitters? Okay. Normally, glutamate is a facilitatory or excitatory neuron. No? When we say facilitatory or excitatory neuron, no? Pag naglabas ng excitatory rather neurotransmitter, no? When glutamate, no, binds to the next neuron, it will usually excite or stimulate, no, that neuron. Okay? Ganun ang ibig sabihin ng facilitatory. That is why kung mapapansin nyo, lahat ng kulay red dito, lahat ng kulay red, sabi natin, lahat ng kulay red ang nilalabas, glutamate. Lahat ng kulay red in this circuit, in these pathways, anong nasa dulo? Positive. Ang ibig sabihin yan, positive, pag naglabas ng glutamate, yung kulay red na neuron na yan, the effect of glutamate to the next neuron, in the series is facilitation or facilitatory. It will excite that neuron to have action potentials so that it will also release its own neurotransmitter. So that is what you mean by excitatory neuron. So as you can see, most of the neurotransmitters of the nerve cells located in the cerebral cortex is glutamate. Now next, another neurotransmitter that is involved in the pathways of the basal ganglia is GABA. GABA stands for gamma aminobutyric acid. And gamma aminobutyric acid or GABA is generally, negative yan, meaning it is generally an inhibitory neurotransmitter. No, sabi natin, alin dyan ng generally, alin dyan ng GABA, yung mga kulay blue. Yung mga kulay blue, ang neurotransmitter niyan ay GABA. Kaya ang nasa dulo nung mga kulay blue, puro negative. Ibig sabihin, ayan pa, negative din. Ibig sabihin, when these neurons are stimulated, yung mga kulay blue na yan, when these neurons are stimulated, magkakaroon sila ng action potential. They will release GABA. And then, the neurons that will receive that GABA will be inhibited. Inhibitory. Ano magiging effect doon sa neurons na yun? Lesser and lesser and lesser action potential. Kasi nga, inhibitory siya. Okay? And then, you have your dopamine. Dopamine, nag-iisa lang naman yung dopaminergic neuron dyan. Galing sa substansya nigra. Particularly, the pars compacta of the substansya nigra. Kasi ang substansya nigra, by the way, is divided into two parts. Yung substansya nigra, pars compacta, okay? Pars, as in pars. Pars. Tapos compacta, compact. Pars compacta. And the substantia nigra pars reticularis. Pars reticularis. So, yung dopaminergic neuron na to, the neuron that releases dopamine, comes from the pars compacta of the substantia nigra. And generally, itong mga dopamine is also depende pala, depende, ang dopamine, okay? Meron siyang facilitatory effect, meron din siyang inhibitory effect, as you can see in this illustration. Pero mamaya, i-discuss natin, depending on the pathways, it is involved, kung ano yung effect ng dopamine in these pathways of the basal ganglia. So let's go back to the direct pathway. So ang una nating i-discuss is the direct pathway. So anong sabi natin kanina? The direct pathway involves how many neurons? 1. Itong kulay red. Tapos, susundan ko lang yung color coding. Magpapalit-ulit ako ng kulay. Tapos, second is itong kulay blue. Tapos third, another kulay blue. Tapos fourth, yung last, is yung kulay red ulit. Pabalik, from the thalamus, pabalik sa cortex. Tatanungin nyo ngayon, bakit po galing sa cortex tapos nag-loop pabalik sa cortex? Again, kasi nga, actually it's from area 4, nag-loop pabalik sa area 4. Because, again, the function of the direct pathway is to facilitate the movement that is being initiated by area 4. So ibig sabihin, kapag ka pala si area 4 mag-i-initiate ng movement bago mo bumaba sa corticospinal tract yung action potential, it must first go down to the basal ganglia and then look back to the cortex before the movement is finally initiated. O, ganun yun. Ha? Okay, so going back, ano yung apat, no? Apat yung neurons na involved. You have your 1, yung kulay red, yung 2, the blue, yung pangatlo, kulay blue pa rin, pang-apat kulay red. So therefore, there are only 2 kinds of neurotransmitters involved here, di ba? Now, for the red, you have glutamate. For the blue, you have GABA. So let's take a look at that, no? Tingnan natin yung neurophysiology of the direct pathway. So as we have said earlier, no, kung si area 4 mag-i-initiate ng movement before the action potential goes down to the corticospinal tract, it must first go to your basal ganglia through the direct pathway. Itong neuron from the cortex, no, going to the striatum, will release glutamate. Kaya yung nasa dulo positive because glutamate is facilitatory. What will be the effect? It will facilitate or it will cause stimulation of another neuron. Ano yung neuron na yon? From the striatum going to the globus pallidus, specifically globus pallidus internus, no? GPI. Palitan natin ang kulay, gawin naman nating blue ngayon. No, yung GPI, ayan, papunta doon sa GPI. Anong nilalabas nitong neuron na to? Since kulay blue, it releases GABA. Okay. Ngayon, anong effect ng GABA, no, doon sa susunod na neuron? No? Yung neuron na yun, from GPI to the thalamus. Anong effect ng GABA? Ang effect ng GABA, as we have said, ayan, negative, inhibitory. So therefore, if it is inhibitory, no, it will inhibit this neuron, meaning less and less and less and less action potentials, no, yung mangyayari into that neuron. So therefore, kung nagkaroon siya ng inhibition, there will be lesser release of GABA on its end in the thalamus. So therefore, kung less GABA, then the thalamus will be disinhibited or released from inhibition. Diba? Kasi kulang yung GABA, no? Or nabawasan yung GABA. Kasi 'di ba? Ano bang effect ng GABA? Inhibitory. Pero pag nag-decrease ang GABA, so therefore the thalamus will be disinhibited, no? So therefore, in effect, this neuron from the thalamus back to the cortex will be, in a sense, facilitated. Okay? So that is how, no, the movement initiated by Area 4 is facilitated by the direct pathway. Because the thalamus on its final, no, do sa final steps, do sa pathway, the thalamus was disinhibited. So therefore, yung ating thalamo-cortical pathway, no, is disinhibited, causing the facilitation or the release of glutamate in the cortex pa rin, facilitating those motions that are being initiated by Area 4. Teka, burahin natin. Red pala yung nailagay ko. Mas maganda blue. Okay. Kahin muna natin to. Ay, blue pala yung nailagay ko. Mas maganda. Red. Yan. Kasi facilitatory. Yan. So that's how, no, it facilitates. Okay? No? And that is the reason why yun na yan, no? That's how it facilitates. Now, let's go to the indirect pathway. Burahin muna natin ulit, no? Yung mga ink. Burahin muna natin ulit yung mga ink. Okay? Para hindi kayo malito. Ayan. So let us discuss naman ngayon yung indirect pathway. Sundan natin indirect pathway. At bakit ba tinawag siya na indirect pathway? Okay. Burahin muna natin itong mga to. Ayan. Ayan. Now, it is called indirect pathway because unlike the direct pathway, kasi di ba, kung titingnan nyo yung direct pathway, no, from the cortex going to the striatum, then from the striatum going to the globus pallidus internus, and then from globus pallidus internus to the thalamus, then from the thalamus to the cortex. Yung indirect pathway, take a look at this, mas mahaba yung dinaanan, o kaya siguro indirect. Indirect pathway also originating from the cortex, going to the striatum also, no? Going to the GPE. Dumaan pa siya sa GPE or globus pallidus externus. And then from the GPE, it went down to the subthalamic nucleus. Di ba yung ating direct pathway, wala naman siyang dinaanan na subthalamic nucleus. And then from the subthalamic nucleus, it went back to the globus pallidus, this time on the GPI, globus pallidus internus, before it finally goes to the thalamus and then going back to the cortex. So let's take a look at the effect of the indirect pathway, no? Doon sa motion that is being initiated by area 4. Indirect pathway, mapapansin nyo, yung cortex going to the striatum, no? Corticostriatal pathway is also a red, no? Red nerve cell, meaning, no, ano siya? It is a glutaminergic neuron, or glutamatergic neuron, meaning it releases glutamate. So ibig sabihin, it will also stimulate or facilitate neurons in the corpus striatum. Pag na-facilitate yung neuron na nasa corpus striatum, it will cause more and more action potential to this, no, GABAergic neuron. Meaning, it will release or it will stimulate the release of GABA. And what is the effect of that GABA to the next neuron? The effect of that GABA to the next neuron is inhibition. Di ba? This neuron will be inhibited. Yung neuron from GPE to the subthalamic nucleus will be inhibited. Meaning, less and less and less and less action potentials because GABA is inhibitory. Less and less and less action potential. So therefore, no, the effect is that you have less GABA release from this neuron, causing now this neuron to be disinhibited. Di ba? Kasi konti yung GABA dito. Di ba GABA is inhibitory? Then, so in a way, this neuron going from subthalamic nucleus through the GPI or globus pallidus internus will be in a way facilitated. Kasi konti yung GABA na lumabas dito. So therefore, this neuron will be facilitated. And if this neuron is facilitated, it will release glutamate. Kulay red siya. So therefore, it will release glutamate. Positive, meaning it will stimulate this neuron from your globus pallidus internus to your thalamus. When this neuron is stimulated, itong neuron na to na stimulate, it will cause more and more and more and more action potentials, causing more release of GABA in the thalamus. So therefore, the thalamus will be inhibited. Okay, kasi maraming GABA. Pag na-inhibit ang thalamus, therefore, less and less and less action potential and will cause less release of glutamate in the cortex. So in that way, no, in that way, the effect will be to inhibit yung mga unnecessary movements that will come along with the initiation of area 4. Okay? No? So therefore, no, kung mapapansin nyo, kaya sabi natin kanina, ang function ng direct pathway is to facilitate the motion. Kasi ang ginagawa ni direct pathway, it disinhibits the thalamus. Di ba? The thalamus is released and the thalamocortical pathway will release more and more glutamate, facilitating the area 4. While the indirect pathway will actually inhibit, no? Will actually inhibit yung thalamus, causing the thalamocortical pathway to release less and less and less glutamate, inhibiting the unnecessary motions that comes along with the movement initiated by area 4. So therefore, no, any lesion to the direct pathway, di ba yung direct pathway, ang gusto niya ma-initiate yung motion, ma-facilitate yung motion. So therefore, no, any damage, no, to those parts of the direct pathway will result, no, to difficulty initiating motion, no? Di ba? Kapag indirect pathway ang na-damage, it will result to a movement disorder that will have difficulty initiating motion. Di ba? Kasi ang function ng direct pathway to facilitate motion. So pag na-damage siya, you will have difficulty initiating motion. It will result to yung tinatawag na hypokinetic movement disorders. Hypokinetic. So hindi makapag-initiate ng movement, hindi makagalaw, no, yung pasyente. Kaya nga hypokinetic, di ba? No? Okay? And one very good example of a hypokinetic movement disorder is Parkinson's disease. No? Okay? Pero wala pa dyan specifically yung damage ni Parkinson's disease. Pero Parkinson's disease is an example of a hypokinetic movement disorder. Kaya mapapansin nyo sa mga Parkinson's disease, they have difficulty initiating motion. They have bradykinesia, no? Mabagal kumilos. No? They have micrographia. No? Maliit yung sulat kasi nga halos hindi na sila makagalaw. No? Hypokinetic movement disorder. Then, since the function of the indirect pathway, no, is to inhibit, no, yung mga unnecessary motion that will come along with the movement initiated by area 4, a damage to the indirect pathway will result to, no, more and more unnecessary motions. No. Kahit hindi gumagalaw, nagkakaroon ng involuntary motions yung pasyente. Anong tawag doon? Ang tawag naman doon is hyperkinetic movement disorder. Pag sinabi mo hyperkinetic movement disorder, there are involuntary motions. Okay? That the patient, no, cannot control. Example ng mga involuntary motions, yung mga jerky movements of the limbs and also of the trunk. Yung kung tawagin ay chorea. No? Okay? Tapos, anong tawag dito? Yung mga balismus. Yun ang mga like for example, yung chorea na nakikita sa Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is an example of a hyperkinetic disorder. No? You also have yung nakikita sa sa Tourette syndrome, no? It is also a damage of indirect pathway. Kaya makita mo sa Tourette syndrome, meron silang mga tics, no? Okay. So basically that's the function of the direct, no? And the indirect pathway. Okay. Now, doon naman tayo sa nigrostriatal pathway. O ano bang function ng nigrostriatal pathway? And earlier, sabi natin, no? Uh, kaya tinawag na nigrostriatal yan, it's because it is from the substantia nigra, particularly from the pars compacta. Ayan ang ano niya, cell of origin niya. Yung kulay green. From the pars compacta of the substantia nigra, no? To the, ayun, no? Striatum. Kaya tinawag siyang nigrostriatal pathway from the substantia nigra to the corpus striatum. And what did we say earlier? Ha? Anong klaseng neuron, no? Yung kulay green na yan. Sabi natin, dopaminergic neuron because it releases primarily dopamine. Ha? And what is the effect, no, of dopamine, no, to the neurons, no, that will receive it? Tingnan nyo, ha? Saan ba nakaano? Kung makikita nyo, no, ang effect niya positive, meaning dopamine, no, is facilitatory or excitatory to the neuron from the striatum going to the globus pallidus internus. Because, no, ang nigrostriatal pathway, no, functions to, okay, facilitate the motions that is being facilitated by the direct pathway. Kung si direct pathway nagfa-facilitate ng motion, di ba? Sabi natin kanina, mas lalo pang ifina-facilitate yon ni nigrostriatal pathway. So therefore, any damage, no, of the neurons located, specifically those dopaminergic neurons located in the pars compacta of the substantia nigra will result to, no, yung less facilitation coming from the dopaminergic neurons. Kaya magiging resulta niyan, ang damage niyan, di doon pa rin sa direct pathway. Mawawala kasi yung facilitation niya sa direct pathway. As you can see, ang connection nitong kulay green, papunta siya doon sa direct pathway. Ayan, no? Ang fina-facilitate niya yung direct pathway. So therefore, again, damage to that dopaminergic neuron of the nigrostriatal pathway will result to hypokinetic disorders pa rin, movement disorders. And in fact, no, yung classic Parkinson's disease, no, the classic damage in the Parkinson's disease is found in that area of the substantia nigra, no, in your pars compacta. No? Okay, so as a summary, let me first erase itong mga ano na to. Ay, wait lang. So as a summary, remember that there are three important pathways that you need to understand, no, in the basal ganglia. Ano yung tatlong pathways na yun? The direct pathway, the indirect pathway, and the nigrostriatal pathway. And again, what is the function of the direct pathway? To facilitate the motions being initiated by the primary motor cortex or area 4. While the indirect pathway is to inhibit, no, the unnecessary motions, no, that will come with the motion initiated by area 4. While the nigrostriatal pathway is to modulate the function of both direct and indirect pathway. And when we say direct pathway, no, it is composed of a series of neurons that extends from the cortex down to the corpus striatum, from the corpus striatum down to the GPI or globus pallidus internus, and then from globus pallidus internus to the thalamus, particularly the VL and the VA nuclei, and then from the thalamus going back to the cortex. When we say indirect pathway, no, it is the series of neurons from the cortex going to the striatum, from the striatum going to the GPE or globus pallidus externus, then from the globus pallidus externus going to the subthalamic nucleus, and then from the subthalamic nucleus back to the globus pallidus. Actually, both externus and internus yan. And then from the globus pallidus internus back to the thalamus, and then back to the cortex. So kaya indirect pathway because dumaan pa siya sa subthalamic nucleus. And then the third pathway is your nigrostriatal pathway from the pars compacta of the substantia nigra going to the striatum. Now, yung neurophysiology ng direct pathway, anong sabi natin kanina, lahat ng kulay red dyan sa drawing na yan ay no, glutamatergic neuron, meaning glutamate ang neurotransmitter. Lahat ng kulay blue ay GABAergic neuron, meaning GABA ang neurotransmitter. Yung nag-iisang kulay green, neurotransmitter is dopamine. Okay? No. So, the effect of direct pathway, no, doon sa motion that is being initiated by area 4, ano nga yun? O, okay? Yung first neuron ni direct pathway releases glutamate, thereby facilitating or stimulating the next neuron, which is from striatum to GPI. No? Oh, so when this neuron is facilitated, di ba, GABAergic neuron siya, it will release GABA in the GPI, causing the next neuron to be inhibited from GPI to the thalamus. Since this will be inhibited, less and less and less action potentials will happen, causing less release of GABA, resulting to disinhibition of the thalamocortical pathway. Meaning, since less GABA, hindi siya mai-inhibit, ang tawag doon, disinhibition, causing the release of more glutamate in the cortex. No? Meaning, it will further facilitate the motion being initiated by area 4 or the primary motor cortex. Yung indirect pathway naman, uulitin natin, indirect pathway, no? Red din siya, yung first neuron. So therefore, no, yung corticostriatal pathway, no, will release glutamate, causing the second neuron to be facilitated, to be stimulated. This neuron from the striatum to the GPE. And since this is facilitated, kulay blue siya, di ba? Anong ilalabas niya? GABA. It will release more and more GABA, causing the third neuron to be inhibited because GABA is inhibitory. When the third neuron is inhibited, it will release less and less GABA in the subthalamus. Okay, kasi kulay blue pa rin siya. Ang inilalabas niya GABA. And since it is inhibited, it will release less GABA. Release of less GABA will result to the disinhibition. Hindi na mai-inhibit itong fourth neuron na to, no? From the subthalamic nucleus to the globus pallidus, which will cause the release of more and more glutamate, which will cause, no, the stimulation of this neuron from the GPI to the thalamus. More and more action potentials will cause the release of more and more GABA in the thalamus, causing the thalamocortical pathway to be inhibited, causing the release of less glutamate in the cortex, therefore inhibiting the unnecessary motions provided by that comes along with area 4. Again, the nigrostriatal pathway releases from the pars compacta of the substantia nigra, releases dopamine. Kapag ka itong mga dopaminergic neurons na to ang nasira sa pars compacta, walang magfa-facilitate, no, ng direct pathway. So in effect, no, parang nasira na rin ang direct pathway mo. Ha? So therefore, there will be difficulty initiating motion. No? It will result to a hypokinetic movement disorder such as a Parkinson's disease. Okay? So that ends our discussion.